Welcome to our webinar, MiFID II, A Practical View, presented by Cordium and Nadel. My name is Sarah Donnelly and I'm the UK Sales Director for Cordium. I will let the rest of the team introduce themselves, starting with Gilly.
Hello, I'm Gilly Green. I'm Director of Wealth and Distribution Practice for Nadel.
Hello, my name is Bobby Johal. I'm the Technical Director in the Compliance Division for Cordium.
Hello, my name is Paul Sutton, Director at Nadel and lead our Institutional and Alternatives Practice, and I've been pleased to be involved in the coming together of the strategic alliance between Nadel and Cordium, offering a best-of-breed solution around regulatory, operating model and technology consulting.
My name is John Wilson. I'm Projects Director at Cordium. I think MiFID II is a great example of how together a regulatory-driven program like MiFID is also going to actually drive a lot of operational change, and a lot of our initiatives will be a key plank in our working together within the alliance.
Thank you. We will split the subject down into two main areas. Section 1 will cover where we are with MiFID II. We'll then move on to Section 2, dealing with MiFID II. Throughout the presentation, you will hear from the Cordium and Nadel representatives. We'll start with the MiFID II timeline discussed by Bobby and Paul.
Thank you, Sarah. So MiFID II entered into force in July 2014, the culmination of at least 3-4 years of politicking, and then in itself precipitating a flood of consultation papers and draft technical standards. The most important of the latter being final report and draft technical standards arriving from ESMA in September 2015. So as things stand, a number of delegated acts remain. The key ones, I think, now are all finalised, and indeed all are expected to be completed by the end of this year. Then we have Member States implementation due to be completed by July 2017, so this time next year. And so far in the UK at least, we've seen the publication of 2 discussion papers, one each from Treasury and the FCA, and the first consultation paper from the FCA came out at the beginning of this year, early last year I think it was. And then we have another consultation paper due in the summer and the further one in the autumn. The first policy statement is due toward the end of this year, at the beginning of next, with, as I say, transposition required by July 2017. So Paul, perhaps you can comment, if you wouldn't mind, on the challenge of project managing a project moving post and whether the landscape is still shifting?
Yes, of course. I think with this piece of change, 2 things set it aside from that which we've seen over recent years. Firstly is MiFID II as a change. It's very far-reaching as it will affect the business, and therefore the business leaders within the companies that we consult to need to look at the strategic impact of this, be that how they manage money, how they interact with their investors and their platforms, etc. So it goes end to end in terms of its potential impact, and therefore if you're trying to do a piece of change in this area, kind of getting those business leaders together to assess those options and make a decision about that which it is you want to do to change will be harder, I believe. And secondly, as you've just highlighted, Bobby, this is not yet buttoned down in terms of detail around what the changes actually are in all of the areas. So from a project point of view, I think it's going to be reasonably challenging, and therefore may not follow a pure sort of linear approach. Some firms are going to need to take some operational hedges, if you like, in terms of what they do in order to meet the timeline and the objectives.
Thank you, gentlemen, for taking us through the timeline and bringing us up to date with where we're currently at. I'd now like to invite Gilly to lead the discussion on the key areas of the impact of MiFID II.
Thank you, Sarah. So right now, I don't think anyone can doubt that the key action is to really understand how the impact of MiFID II is on your business. And I think we have to accept that whilst there are some moving goalposts, we can operate on what we know already. There is a technical interpretation, but we also need to consider actually how we need to respond to that according to your business model. So I think it is worth saying that you should be thinking about triaging these requirements in terms of 3 things. The scope of the requirement for you, the difficulty of doing it in relation to where you are currently and where you've got to get to, and also the capacity that you have to be able to do those changes and that comes from both you and your suppliers. And using those three things really to understand what priorities you need to apply. Now, to help in this context, we have categorized the impact across four main elements of business change, really. That is data and technology, people and processes, governance, and fairness and transparency. We've taken each subject, and in each case we have given each of these a red, amber and green rating for each subject. So whilst we can't give you specific answers for your business in one short seminar, what we can do is actually help you to determine how you analyse the impact and where you need to focus on finding those practical solutions.
Thank you. As we move on to the MiFID II puzzle, I'll hand over to John Wilson and then on to Bobby to discuss Brexit.
Thanks, Sarah. I think one of the challenges of MiFID is it's just vast coverage and impact across so many different areas. It is a market in financial instruments directive, and that broad coverage has an impact certainly within capital markets, within traditional asset management, and within wealth management and algorithmic trading and high frequency trading. It's a very, very broad directive. You're covering, what, 500 pages or so of directive material and pre-log, and then 1,000 or so pages of technical standards advice. So what we sought to do was to break it down into different areas. And this puzzle here just illustrates the different areas that we've tried to cover around market related, around business organisation related, and also around client and governance related. We've mapped all of the articles into this structure. There are some articles that relate to regulatory standards for the different competent authorities, so they're not included. But the main ones that are affecting the firms, we've mapped into this structure, and also all the underlying technical standards and technical advice documentation. So got a fairly comprehensive analysis which will be driving the gap analysis that we'll be able to assist firms with. And what we'll be doing is just breaking these down and highlighting a few of the key areas we think are relevant to firms.
So moving on to the rather large and imposing shadow, perhaps that's over this discussion is the issue of Brexit, of course. I think the first thing to say is it may well have been a lot simpler prior to 2008. Simple reason being, since the financial crisis, we've seen a significant increase in the amount of EU legislation, and importantly, a move away from directives towards regulations. Directives, of course, must be implemented into local member state law, and so in that sense, an EU framework already exists in the UK in the form of statute and, for example, in financial services, the FCA handbook. Regulations, on the other hand, are directly applicable. So therefore, on Brexit, there is this small matter of a legal vacuum. But before we really get into the issue of Brexit, there are really important decisions to be made, and not more so than the position of the UK government and indeed of the EU negotiators. So those factors will determine the terms and the timing of the exit. So just on the issue of a timeline, we can posit very briefly the following: Article 50 is invoked at some point within the next 6 months. Thereafter, negotiations kick off between the UK and the EU, sometime, let's say, in Q1 or Q2 of 2017. The deal is then presented to the European Council. In terms of the process thereafter, at least 20 countries with at least a 65% majority of the EU population must approve the terms of that exit, that negotiation. And then ultimately, the deal must be ratified by the European Parliament. So we can broadly guesstimate that the UK exit may take place at some point in H1 2019. So therefore, if we accept that timeline, we have at least a 12 to 18 month overlap between Brexit and the timeline of MiFID. So if we are to take the third country option, the so-called World Trade Organization option, and that's a big if, of course, EU obligations do fall away, ceasing to be directly, we will cease to be directly subject to those regulations, but that's unlikely to mean a brave new world of financial services regulations. The UK has taken a very prominent leading role in many of these financial services regulations that we now find ourselves having to contend with, and played a key role in shaping those roles. And it may be the case that for both political and pragmatic reasons, none more so than perhaps the future equivalent determinations conversations that may need to be had, it's important to recognise that the financial services regime that we're likely to face post-Brexit is not going to be so dissimilar from the one we have to negotiate right now. So when pondering the imponderable author and in the words of the SDAs who made the following statement on the day of Brexit, firms must continue to abide by their obligations under UK law, including those derived from EU law, and continue with implementation plans for legislation that is still to come into effect.
So thank you, Bobby. MiFID II is here to stay. Cordium and NADL have looked to combine our technical understanding of the regulation and NADL's in-depth understanding of operational issues around this piece of regulation. We've broken this down into 6 pieces of the puzzle. We'll start with the subject of general client communication. I believe John and Gilly are going to take that one.
Thanks, Sarah. I think the point Bobby made there about the FCA informing a lot of the MiFID II agenda is absolutely right. And in terms of general client communication, we can see the influence of things like the retail distribution review and client suitability and the focus on conduct risk. But I think the key change here is that there's much more of these rules were going to apply to professional clients. There isn't really a carve-out for them. So whereas I think we've traditionally viewed this area as a retail focus, it's going to be applicable to all firms. In terms of the information that's required for communication purposes, information around costs and related charges, information around the overall costs and the cumulative effect on the overall return, information on investment strategies, and information on execution venues, and we'll touch on that more later. Whether the advice being provided is independent or is based on a restricted review of the market, whether the firm is providing ongoing assessment of suitability or is a one-off requirement, and then appropriate guidance and risk warnings. Things that we're fairly familiar with, and they come from the Level 1 directive. Delving down into the technical advice, and then we get into this fact that it's applicable to all clients, whether retail or professional. But although there's some carve-outs to allow limited application of the rule, there's an explicit requirement that there's no carve-out where investment advice or portfolio management is received. So these are going to impact people who are providing discretionary investment management services. Where more than one firm is involved, then there's a requirement to provide information around the costs of all of the service providers on an aggregated basis. And those costs would cover things like management fees, advisory fees, exit fees, termination fees, switching costs, broker commissions, entry and exit charges, platform fees, and research. So the whole sort of range of fees to get a total cost view on the fund. And so because of its impact around professional clients, it's actually going to reach into some of the alternative space, alternative managers, and potentially even private equity mandates where they're managed on a segregated basis. So it's quite encompassing in its potential impact across the investment management arena.
Yes, thank you, John. I would also add to that, whilst the wealth managers may have been used to divulging a certain amount of this information, there are still some key challenges with it. And one of those, I think, is the element of prediction, where you're talking about fees. You have to disclose at the point of sale what you think those fees might be over the period of the advice. So there are some challenges, and I would say to clients to focus definitely on how you're going to source this data. Whilst we've only put data as an amber rating on this at the bottom of the slide, I would say that we do need to think hard about what you're going to present to the client, where you're going to get it from, and how consistent it's going to be. So we know also that custodians are going to be providing a valuation alongside the holdings that they used to provide. Is the pricing going to be equivalent to that which a manager is providing? So elements like that, understanding the consistency, understanding what your clients might then have questions about. And there are elements of how that data is presented in a standard way. So timeliness and the currency of that data are clearly important. But even more than that, and something that the FCA don't often give guidance on or consider that well, in my opinion, is what does your audience actually want? And John's mentioned that institutional managers and hedge fund managers will also be caught by this, but it is about understanding the level of knowledge of your client, whether they're going to understand the information you're giving them, so you need to think very carefully about the format that is presented in. Notwithstanding that, when clients are confused or want to question that data, certainly in the early days after implementation, there will be an impact on key staff, people who have the relationship and face off to the client. So the training, the impact on those staff and appropriate resourcing will also need to be thought very hard about. You know, some of the elements of this that don't seem to play into complexity might also be a consideration. So, for instance, valuation or statements must be delivered quarterly under the MiFID II, and that could actually incur additional costs, whether that's supplier costs because they're charging you on a rate card that includes a per valuation, or whether it's just consumables if you are, as some of the more traditional private client managers are, is providing high quality paper reports. You might well be doubling the amount of cost of those. I think what is absolutely key here, though, is how you deliver this information to clients. So if you haven't already gone down the route of providing information online, I think this will very much be a driver to do so. If you provide information online, it means you can allow the client to drill down to the level of information that they're comfortable with. Institutional managers can get the nth degree of information around predictive fees or performance, and then private clients may well be able to have less information in one go if that suits them. So I think if you're not already looking at online, I do think that you should consider putting at least some, if not all, of the information there, even if clients still do want to have paper reports as well. So there are some technical solutions that are out there already, but certainly should be thinking about how you can deliver this efficiently and at least giving your staff time to resolve queries from clients as they come in.
Thank you, Julie. Some interesting points there on the audience and how you're planning around this. We'll now move on to market data and transaction reporting with Paul and Bobby.
Thank you, Sarah. MiFID II and MiFIR sets out a range of requirements pertaining to market data issues, most of which directly affects trading venues. I think it's fair to say the primary issue for the buy side is likely to be the reporting of transactions, transaction reporting under Article 26 of MiFIR. So MiFIR broadens the scope of the reporting regimes that apply to all transactions and instruments that are traded on an EU regulated market, and indeed any instrument, including listed or OTC, where the underlying is an instrument that is admitted to trading on such venues, and the latter requirement actually is already in play in the UK, where the rules are slightly super equivalent to it, they are compared to with the EU. So previously, what that means is the previously exempt bonds, interest rates, commodity and FX derivatives now will come into scope, plus OTC contracts traded on the new OTF facilities, organised trading facilities that are introduced by MiFID II. So the new rules also, as well as increasing scope, bring in a significant increase in the amount of data points within a report itself, from the current 23 to approximately 65, including a range of new elements, including an ID code for the portfolio manager or committee that made the decision to deal in that particular transaction, and also if the trade was executed by an algorithm, an internal code used to identify that algorithm. So this is, of course, likely to have a material impact on organisations with regard to planning, implementation of the collation and interpretation and reporting of the data. The new rules also bring into being some increased controls around governance and the control and testing, and these are the moment that one might say sort of informal best practice arrangements, but the new rules codify these types of issues. So there's an explicit requirement for firms to establish an adequate ongoing control framework framework to ensure complete and accurate reporting and an end-to-end testing and reconciliation process. Historically, the whole issue of transaction reporting, many buy-side firms have been able to place reliance on brokers to report for them the so-called portfolio manager exemption. However, this has been replaced by a much narrower exemption called, commonly referred to as a transmitting firms exemption. Now, some managers may be able to avail themselves of that exemption, but there are certain requirements around that use of the exemption, including the submission of certain data points and the need to have an SLA in place with the delegated firm. However, the issue really is that given the amount of requirements, the number of requirements one must satisfy to use a transmitting firm exemption means that in all likelihood and the practical possibility of using that exemption is likely to be very narrow. And so what we're expecting is many firms to assume responsibility for the transaction reporting themselves. So Paul, so what do you foresee as the initial challenge, the practical implementation challenge around this area?
Yeah, a couple of initial observations. Firstly, when we talk to our clients around gap analysis that they've already done or have underway, transaction reporting is always normally high up on the list. First thing. Second is, for many clients, data management and data solutions have been a challenge for many years. I think that what MiFID 2 is going to do here, both on the institutional trading side, plus we'll come on in other areas later, is going to take that and make it a much harder part of the business over coming years. So I think what we're seeing is firms with quite complicated operating models, be they in a single country or more usually in regions and spread around the world, looking at the sources of their data, and the challenges they really face are around both timing of gathering that data and then transforming it before reporting it, but also ensuring consistency at those different reporting points. So those challenges, when they come into the mix, means that people we're seeing are stepping back, not in all cases, but in many cases, to kind of think about what's their data solution going forward. If they're in an outsourcing relationship, they may have been more aligned than they probably will be able to be in the future on their outsourced partner. So they're looking at their current architecture to see kind of how that will work end to end, and in particular how they get to store and distribute that data in a timely manner. I think the other thing, which is not necessarily operating model and technology based, is the cost of that data, the commerciality around it in terms of who produces it, who sells it, where that gets sold into within the value chain, and the extent to which the investment businesses can rely upon that under an existing contract with their vendor or their service provider, or whether they need to kind of look at that again from an overall commercial point of view.
I think it's also maybe fair to say that the rules here, both here and elsewhere in MiFID, foresee a much greater degree of oversight and ownership of the firms in terms of managing any outsourced relationships. There is a much stronger emphasis on having an understanding and control of the entire end-to-end process. I think that's what the rules are. I think we can conclude that's what they foresee.
Yeah. If I could add to that, I think also what we've seen is the firms have treated this as a compliance problem, and often this has been the compliance to report it. And one of the emphasis here, I think, is because of the vast amount of data needs to be collected and reported, it's becoming an operating problem.
Yeah, I think if you're going to need to solve it once, then you should be thinking about it both from regulatory reporting, but also institutional client reporting in a digital environment, risk reporting, etc. So it's an opportunity to kind of try and deal with that data challenge kind of once, as opposed to many different times.
Absolutely, thank you. Now moving on to our sections on investment advice and product governance with John and Jelly.
Okay, so investment advice really is looked at through the prism of client suitability, which has been a key area again of focus for the FCA. In terms of the requirements in the directive, again, they're based off of largely UK requirements, so the need for a client suitability assessment, need for assessment of the investor's knowledge and experience specific to the products that are being sold, detailing of their financial situation, their ability to bear financial loss, information on their risk tolerance and the investment objectives that they have for the investment strategy. completion of a client fact find before giving advice, and agreement of terms of business before services are being provided. Suitability angle is actually interesting because it's a suitability of all investment decisions, even those that are not resulting in a buy or a sell of an investment. And they also apply to the switching requirement to the extent that switches, there needs to be an assessment to ensure that the costs of the switch involved are relative to the benefits of the transaction. And where ongoing responsibility exists, then the firm will need to have in place to demonstrate it has appropriate procedures to maintain adequate up-to-date information about the clients. Now, there is within the directive scope for firms to determine the extent to which they'll collect information. So there's nothing prescriptive here about what information they should collect. And I think that leaves scopes for firms to have a certain amount of uncertainty as to what information that they're going to actually need to collect from different types of services. And clearly firms will leverage a lot around existing FCA data standards and guidance. And there's also this requirement here which is around ensuring that the data collected from the client is reliable. And I think that's not just about the disclosures the clients are making. This is really around the whole framework in which it's collected, your questionnaires, the types of questions you ask, how easy it is to understand, your explanation of the importance of this data collection within the fiduciary responsibility that you have. And I think that needs thinking through in terms of the whole sort of parameters of collecting information to ensure client suitability. And there's also, I think we've seen it before, kind of question mark around responsibility, particularly where people use the tools, automated tools like robo-advisory tools to provide advice. And the directive here is quite clear in terms of technology that the firm that is actually providing the investment service is responsible for any suitability assessment, even where the provision of data information may be provided by a technology platform.
Yes, John, I agree. The elements of suitability for the UK are not so much of an uptick on what we have already, but there are, as you say, a couple of changes where the advisors are concerned to do with the switching, understanding the cost benefits of a switch, and against the risk-reward profile of the proposed investment. And also the suitability reports where there must be a communication to the client of the suitability decisions and also the regularity and managing expectations of how and when it should be done again, and if there are triggers, and explaining what those triggers would be. I would say, though, that despite the fact that our regulations are already close to this, I think it is seen by the FCA report that was done in December last year that good practice is still not in place in this industry. So I think the review came out with only 1/3 of those clients they assessed actually didn't need any actions, 1/3 needed some action, and 1/3 were actually very poor. So I think MiFID 2 is an opportunity for everybody to review these processes, because the FCA is not going to stop scrutinising, and they will be looking for those upticks that we do have for MiFID 2. So I think it's worth just saying, in terms of solutions for suitability, firms should be looking at how they demonstrate it, and that's one of the key criticisms from the FCA, is you might well have done it, but how do we know if you haven't documented it and recorded it thoroughly? And I think to do that, one of the things that firms have to do is live it and really embed it in the culture with their staff buy-in, and making sure that it just becomes part and parcel of their day-to-day job. Having said that, I do think it's important for firms to make it as easy as possible for their relationship managers or investment advisors to actually put good practice in place. So whether that's providing the right tools for them or the time to do what they need to do as far as the admin is concerned, that is absolutely key. Some firms I know are implementing mobile technology where their relationship managers can actually record directly onto systems on their way home from a client meeting, assuming they're coming back by train, of course. But also there's an element there that needs to be played back to the client to ensure it's accurate and to ensure the client understands it. And just reinforcing what you have just said, John, around making sure that the not only is the advice suitable and appropriate, but actually how it is communicated is also appropriate for the client's understanding. And I think this whole thing about investment advice is now moving, and we'll see that when we talk about product governance, is it's moving across the whole value chain of the business. So whilst, as you say, platforms might well have some robo-advice and some automated process to determine suitability, there is a strong element there that needs to be played back somehow to the clients and make sure they understand it.
Because we used to do things like client file reviews, and the FCA's will indeed do their own client file reviews. So you mentioned technology there. Do you think technology can be a big driver towards evidencing suitability?
Yes, absolutely it can. And I've seen firms who have gone whole hog to implement quite a sophisticated risk profiling solution across questionnaires, determining exactly what products clients should invest in. If you do that, you absolutely need to make sure that your advisors and relationship managers thoroughly understand the inputs and outputs of that process, so that if there are any deviances from what they might expect, they can explain it. So that's one element. But equally, one of my clients was in that group that was reviewed by the FCA, and they were one of the ones who came out as being really quite top of the class, ticking all the boxes. And they have very few systems to do this. They just have some very good processes and a really good collegiate approach to the way that they review files. So, for example, they will have a whole peer group where one person his client files are actually pulled out to review, and the whole group review them and make sure that they're up to scratch. Quite a brave approach, but it also means that everybody is learning about what good practice looks like when somebody is doing it well.
And I think that fiduciary responsibility is key to this product governance thing, aspects of the directive as well. And to just move on to now, in terms of the requirements, again, this draws a lot on the agenda that's being implemented within the retail sector here. So, approval process covering financial instrument development and changes to those financial products, identification of target market for clients and risks associated with the products, reviewing those risks on an ongoing basis, and indeed that having a feed through to your suitability, responsibility, and oversight if you've taken on that ongoing suitability responsibility, which a manager logically should. Understanding the characteristics of the target market, but also passing on responsibility to distributors, so not only the people that manufacture the products, but also those that distribute those. In the Level 2 directive, there's an extension of responsibility around this governance piece to the wider market in terms of whether or not a product is likely to have an impact on the stability of financial markets, and an assessment before those products are launched. Responsibility around training, that staff are properly trained in the characteristics of the products that they are promoting and marketing. Design process identifies who the products are suitable for, but importantly, who they're not suitable for. And then the management themselves are receiving information. It's said in the directive from compliance reports, whether they're from the compliance department or not, that's not clear, but actually they are receiving information that is sufficient to enable management demonstrate that they've got control over the product governance process. And as I said, these obligations are going to apply to distributors as well as manufacturers. In a way, I think what they're trying to do is create this kind of what I describe as a virtuous circle of communication between manufacturer, distributor, and client. So really, no one's going to be allowed off the hook on this one. Each party is responsible for their role in the distribution chain and in the quality of the product and the target that it's being directed to. And so that's going to have implications potentially, we think, on the alternative managers who, they may consider themselves under the AIFM directive, but if they are managing discretionary mandates, then they're going to be subject to these rules because the investment management design of the strategy is going to be caught by these product governance rules. But if those funds are being distributed by another party and the firm itself doesn't consider itself to have direct obligations under the MiFID directive, then they're going manager around who the target market is and what the risks associated are with the products.
Yes, John, and I think one of the things to note is at the receiving end of all this information, you have the advisors. They are used to looking at suitability. So the challenges really lie with the distributors and manufacturers here, because this is the first time for them going through having this responsibility. And whilst we've only put an amber on our reg rating for data, data is key here, and rather than about finding the data, it's more about the consistency of how that data is shared from manufacturers to distributors and advisors. I think just using the example of target market definitions, looking at those, what exactly is their target market. Certainly when we analyse the investor market and investor profile, there's a whole range of different types of investors in the market. It's not just retail, professional and the like. So really understanding what that target market is and the age of those investors and what sort of risk profile they're going to want to take, I think, you know, depending on how deep they're able to go, that will definitely be something to look out for. And I would say for manufacturers and potentially distributors as well, is think about getting involved with their peer group in the industry to make sure we can get some standardisation across this. One of the other challenges, I think, just on the data side, is how we deal with execution-only clients. Because certainly at the moment, the platforms do not collate the amount of information that they will need to be able to assess who is actually buying their product and whether it is appropriate. So I think that is something that we'll need to work with the platforms to thoroughly understand what needs to be done there. You know, and clients themselves, going back and asking them for more data after you've already opened an account is a terribly difficult thing to do. So I think that there are some challenges around that area. But again, this is about who is the audience, and that's where the focus is coming from MiFID II generally, transparency and the end investor. But I think what you said, a virtuous circle of communication, every firm, no matter what their role, does need to have a very good grip on what their obligations are in this area. And I think understanding exactly how products are also categorised by MiFID will also be key.
Also, it's unlike the transaction reporting where you can identify all the fields that are required. The information to be shared between manufacturer and distributor is not defined. It's just a required set of information already agreed. So that's that point about talking to each other and actually agreeing on a collective basis what's required.
And just to echo that, Paul, I think you're going in and talking to what are notionally institutional managers, whilst they will have a data challenge, as I described, around the trading side, the bigger headache potentially for them is around the distribution side. And I think the consequence of that might also be they look at how many people they distribute through at the moment, and is that challenge worth going through with that many parties when you look at it all end to end. So it may not be a case of solving a data point, it might be in conjunction with that, looking at the commercial model and around the total number of platforms used, because what are you going to do with all of this data when you get it through, and how are you going to demonstrate that suitability end to end, and is the cost of that and the risk associated with that actually worthwhile for that channel?
Yeah, and I think just to reinforce that, Paul, those that are distributing to advisors directly and not through platforms will probably have the biggest challenge, because they may well be distributing to thousands of small IFAs, and I think it's significant that in the UK we have that model, whereas in the rest of Europe a lot of the distribution is through large banks and insurance companies. So I think it is a challenge maybe specific to the UK.
Absolutely. Thank you all for that. We'll now move on to trade execution and conflicts and inducements with Bobby and Paul.
Thank you, Sarah. Turning to the issue of trade execution first, MiFID II, superficially at least, does not propose significant changes to the requirements here. However, there are a couple of very noteworthy enhancements to the rules, namely the obligation to provide a more detailed execution policy to your clients, and also to publish on an annual basis top 5 execution venues that are used. Best execution was a concept introduced by the first MiFID, but I think it's fair to say success has been arguable. Primarily, the issue really is around difficulties regarding the objective measurement of best execution of all asset classes, apart from those, of course, that are traded on exchange, the most liquid securities. There's a couple of things that MiFID II does that may improve this issue. Firstly, the concept of the new consolidated tape of transactions across all EU trading venues should help the issue of price discovery, of course. And execution venues themselves also have to publish annually the quality of execution they provide, so giving the buy side some actual data that they can work with when determining their own execution venue decisions. Turning to the issue of the best execution policy, this issue is noteworthy in that during the course of the consultation process, the standard of execution policies were heavily criticised, really, one can say. So there's been a number of enhancements required to be made in this respect. So the number of instrument classes and indeed subclasses that need to be differentiated within a firm's order execution policy is expanded to 38. So the extent to which firms trade on all of those asset classes and subclasses, you'll need to set out your policy with respect to a number of things, including the execution factors that you're permitted to take into account in respect of each, and the relative importance you ascribe to each of those factors and the execution factors, and the list of venues and brokers that you're able to trade, agreed venues and brokers that you're able to trade with each of those for each of those subclasses. So overall, there's a significant enhanced expected of a firm's execution policy. On the point about the annual disclosure, firms will be required to produce and make public an annual disclosure setting out for each subclass of instrument that you trade, your top 5 execution venues in terms of trading volumes, and information on the quality of the execution obtained in respect of each of those. And I think that's an undertaking that's really not to be underestimated in terms of the challenge of collating all the data and processing it in terms of personnel is required to compile and organise it. So to turn to you, Paul, what are the sort of challenges you see here?
Yeah, picking up, I think the theme is consistent here. It will cause firms to look at how they gather and store data around this. Is their front office solution and systems up to being able to cope with that challenge? So we're seeing, as a result of both this and the market data slide earlier, firms stepping back and looking at both the applications they use in the front office and whether they can be used as a tool to support this, and all the data solutions. Moreover, and in some cases, MiFID II is acting as the tipping point around the strategy and the business case to do that. It will differ depending upon kind of the level of complexity in your model, be that the range of instruments and/or locations from which you trade from. A number of our clients, not all, but a number of our clients are outsourced, and therefore in reasonably mature outsourcing arrangements with service providers in the middle office investment operations space. And over the years, those service providers have talked to those clients around bringing a trade execution service to that client. I would say more often than not, the clients have resisted that for reasons such as best execution, kind of staying close to the brokers and to the market. The fund managers and obviously will differ quite significantly across instruments also. But this might be the opportunity for firms to step back and look at that and say, do we want to be doing this? Is this an area where we think we can really kind of create value given the costs and the risks and the challenges around where something like MiFID II is taking us? So I think there will be more dialogue happening between the service providers and the asset management community about can the service providers come upstream. The challenge will be can they meet all of the varying markets and instruments.
That's a really important point. I think it's really what the directive seeks to achieve here, and what the consultation seeks to achieve is a real improvement in the adherence to the idea and the principle and the concept of best execution. I think that's implicit in some of the consultation papers, where firms are actually, as well as the execution factors, firms are asked to consider the overall fairness of the price proposed. So there really is a move towards bringing, as you say, the market participants together to really achieve the underlying principles behind this concept.
Fantastic. Now moving on to conflicts and inducements.
Thank you, Sarah. So on the issue of conflicts and inducements, I think it's fair to say this is one of the most controversial provisions in the course of the consultation process, and one that caused much delay at the negotiation stage. And that is the thing that can be summarised as causing the issue is really been the so-called ban on inducement. Regarding the provision of advice and portfolio management, level 1 of MiFID has a broad requirement that fees, commissions, monetary and non-monetary benefits provided by a third party may not be accepted, and only minor non-monetary benefits are allowed, the so-called ban on inducement. But any benefits must meet 3 basic conditions, namely they must enhance the quality of services provided, received by the end investor, they must not impair the duty to act in the best interest of clients, and the question of disclosure. And it's worth just very quickly touching upon the journey that the development of rules has taken here. So going back to the technical advice that was issued in December 2014, the important point was reached, a decision was made that said that research does indeed fall within what is considered to be a very wide definition of investment, and importantly that bespoke third-party research does not fall within the concept of the exemption of minor non-monetary benefits. And the idea behind this is that ESMA perceives a risk that without the restriction, investment managers' duty to act in the best interest of clients would indeed be impaired, and it, ESMA, considers that there is a risk that firms may be influenced to direct order flows to gain access to more valuable research. And those 2 points are very important in that the FCA themselves have made them both and share that view around those, around the almost inherent, what was described in actual fact as the inherent conflict of interest that exists in this space. The advice provided a few examples of what may be considered minor non-monetary benefits, which included some very basic information related to the instrument or service being provided. Some of it is generic and personalised. It's generic or it's personalised to the clients. Participation in conferences and seminars, and some minor reasonable de minimis value hospitality, but importantly neither the concept of reasonable or de minimis was defined. However, an important exemption was created at this point, which provides that investment research is not an inducement if the manager pays for it themselves from their own balance sheet, if it's paid from a funded, budgeted and agreed and disclosed research payments account, the so-called RPA, provided that that RPA had no linkage to trade volume, which many considered sounded the death knell for CSAs. A few other conditions are included, that there must be a written research policy provided to clients, and firms should assess the quality of research purchased, and firms must maintain a register of all inducements, which is what they currently do, but importantly that they must state how each of these inducements enhance the quality of services to be provided. As a necessary corollary to these rules, and something that the asset management community has been asking for a while, it is provided that brokers must identify separate charges for execution and of the services, and the provision of those research and other ancillary services should not be conditional upon the amount of flow that's directed to them. The important delegated directive that followed the technical advice largely follows ESMA's original position, but importantly they introduced the possibility of the continued use of CSAs. Article 13.3 provides that the operational arrangement for the collection of the client research charge, where it is not collected separately but alongside a transaction commission, shall indicate a separately identifiable research charge, which must comply with the conditions relating to the operation of RPA. So that form of words seemingly allows for the funding of an RPA by a single bundle commission charge from the clients insofar as it complies with the other provisions related to the use of an RPA. And just finally touching on an important extension of the applicability of these rules, these rules are instrument neutral, so they do also apply to the FIC markets, being fixed income, currency and commodities. The FCA's view is that research is embedded within bid-offer spreads, and I know that some of the in the industry differ with that view, maintaining that prices are actually net, and then plus the product of a supply and demand and other variables, including counterparty risk. So if that's actually true, then we will see the case that clients are currently having to, clients going forward will have to pay for research that is currently and genuinely free. So it's quite a change in market practice. And the FCA's view is that this decoupling will result in narrowing of spreads, and importantly, as part of their competition remit, will also open up the market for smaller research firms into this space, and therefore potentially enhancing the quality of research provided.
I need to add to that, Bobby, like you said, it's played out in both with the regulator and in the press over recent months. I think once a firm has decided strategically how it wants to play it with regards to positioning itself with its clients, then clearly that path, be that it funds it itself, as a number of firms have come out and said, versus a separate client account, will have a consequence on the operating model in terms of collecting the information relating to this to these costs, tracking that, and then depending upon what path is taken, how you allocate that out across clients and evidence it, more importantly, to both internal governance processes and the regulator when they come in.
Thank you. So, in summary, as we stated at the beginning, Brexit isn't changing anything. MiFID II is here to stay. Really, the takeaways from today, you really need to look at your business needs. You need to start identifying issues. You need to start creating a plan, looking at change, and specifically at resource requirements. Cordium and NADL have been working together. We have a strong record of effective advisory consultancy, both on the business change and the regulatory side. What we're offering is a unified approach to the MiFID II problem, and a solution that is right for your firm. Different firms are going to find different challenges. We've talked through the 6 steps here. Any one of those may be more of a challenge than others to you. And what we look to do is work with you through those challenges. Thank you for your time this afternoon. I hope you found it useful. Please feel free to reach out to your usual contact at either Cordium or NADL. Alternatively, there is an email address on the slides if you'd like to email us directly. Thank you.